Okay, are we on? Thank you. Well, welcome tonight. It's great to have everyone here tonight, and let's start with brief introductions of our guests. We have people here that have worked with the city, those that are neighbors that have different jobs that they do there, and we want to hear what you do. So I'm going to start with Jim Lockheed, who is from Denver Water. He is the current CEO, and would you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us about you and what you do at Denver Water.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a real privilege and honor, and we look forward to continuing to cooperate and have dialogue with the City of Westminster on ways we can work together on water issues and anything else. I'm Jim Lockhead. I'm the CEO of Denver Water. I've been at Denver Water since 2010. Before that, I was a lawyer in Western Colorado doing water rights work, including water rights work for a number of municipalities in Western Colorado. I represented Colorado on interstate Colorado River negotiations for about 25 years. I was also executive director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources in the late 1990s. So again, it's a real privilege to be here.
Thank you. Next we have Adam, and is it Jokerst?
Jokerst, yes.
Jokerst. And you are currently the Deputy Director of Water Resources in the City of Greeley. Welcome.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thanks for inviting a neighbor to the north. I'm Adam Jokerst. I'm Deputy Director for Water Resources at the City of Greeley. I've been with Greeley for a little over 3 years, and before that 6 years with the City of Fort Collins. So all that time in northern Colorado. At Greeley, I oversee our water acquisition, our operation of our mountain assets, our non-potable system, our water conservation program, and plenty of other duties as assigned.
Thanks. And if I can have everybody be sure to almost like eat the mic, because it is going live so everybody can hear at home, or whoever's tuned in, that would be wonderful. Next we have former City Manager Brent McFall. Flew in this afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Talk to us a little bit about, as City Manager, because you didn't run the utility, but tell us a little bit about how you did run the utility.
What did you do? So again, I'm Brent McFall. I'm a retired city manager at a 42-year career in local government management. The last 14 of those as Westminster city manager from 2001 to 2015. And then retired to the mountains, and now have retired to the mountains of Arizona. As city manager, you have overall responsibility for the daily operation of the city, and that includes utilities. And Mr. Christopher will tell you much the same thing. At the 30,000-foot level on all water issues, from distribution to maintenance to. It was obviously the responsibility of the Public Works and Utilities Department employees to, and the direction that they received from the city manager. So I was pretty heavily involved, but not at a detail level.
Thank you. Next, Bill Christopher, another one of our city managers. And I know it wasn't under you, I don't believe, was it under you that we started conservation?
Started what, I'm sorry?
Conservation of water?
That was a little before me.
But you were working with the city at that time, yeah.
I was assistant city manager at the time. I'm Bill Christopher, also retired Westminster city manager. My career with Westminster was 33 of my 36 years. Brent lasted longer in the trenches than I did. But I started out as assistant city manager, worked with 3 different city managers during that time. Became city manager in 1978, May of 78, and I retired in May of 2001. And during that time, thank you. You want me to start over? During that time, we experienced a tremendous amount of growth. I would just say when I came on board as assistant city manager in 1968, Westminster was a sleepy bedroom community, suburban community of about 18,000 people. Very little commercial, no industrial or primary job creation to speak of. When I retired, city was about 102,000 thereabouts, and we grew quite a little bit during that time, and we can talk about that later as far as what we did to keep up and stay ahead of the development and the demand created by development. And I'll like to talk a little bit about the growth management plan that was implemented right before I became manager under Steve Garman's leadership. And I would just echo what Brent indicated as far as the role of the city manager is not to be a technician, not to be a department head as far as overseeing a particular department, but to pull all that together and make sure that policy that's set by city council is carried out by the city administration. That's our primary job, along with providing options or different recommendations on how to go about implementing different policies, whether it's water rates, which is current topic, or zoning, or expanding parks, recreation, open space, those sort of things.
Thanks, and I will come back to growth management plan
okay,
after we
fine.
get everybody settled. Tom Settle has also been with Westminster. He was a former water treatment superintendent. Tell us a little bit about you and what you did.
Great. I have retired now from a 45-year career. I worked for the City of Westminster for 38 years in a variety of capacities, and then finished my career at the City of Boulder and retired as Deputy Director of Utilities for Boulder. Westminster, I had the fortune to work a variety of different positions within Public Works entirely, but within the Water Resources Division, as watershed coordinator, and then as the water quality administrator before I went back to the water plant and served as superintendent for 14 years before quasi-retiring from Westminster and moving on to a different job. But I saw many of the things that Bill discussed, and in terms of the growth and how we manage things, as well as a transition in utilities to maintaining our water system, not being so much in the growth mode but in the maintenance mode, and charged with providing feedback to our administrators on what those needs were, and towards the end of my career here, coordinating that with the engineering group that had been put together within the Public Works Department, which the first 30 years of my career, we didn't have an engineering group within the utilities department. So it was quite a learning experience for me, and one that I enjoyed the entire time I was here. So I'm happy to provide whatever feedback I can.
Thank you. Adam, I know you have a presentation, or you have slides, or?
I do not, but I believe Jim does.
Oh, okay. I didn't remember which one did, but whoever has that, do we have that queued up that we can see it and let them present? No?
Oh. arrow, is that?
You know, it always happens after you test it.
Yeah.
We could tell city manager jokes in the meantime. And I got a million of them.
There we go. Okay, thanks.
They're funny. Good point.
So it's my understanding that you wanted to, first of all, have a brief overview, and I mean brief overview of Denver Water's system before we talk about the process that led to the planning and construction of our North Water Treatment Plant. Just to share our experience with you. Does that sound
That sounds great.
like what you want to hear? Okay. So real briefly, you have a handout as well. Denver Water serves about 1.5 million customers, about a quarter of the state's population, about half of which are inside the city and county of Denver and about half located outside the city and county of Denver. Whoops, wrong way now.
Yep. There it goes.
There we go. We have a pretty extensive water system. Our watershed area encompasses about 4,000 square miles, which is about the size of the state of Delaware. Denver Water is actually the third largest public landowner in the state of Colorado. I won't go through our entire system, but as you can see, we have two basic components of the water system. The north system, which originates in the Fraser River Basin in Grand County and diverts water through the Moffett Tunnel into South Boulder Creek, and then into Gross Reservoir, and then water is diverted across into our Moffett treatment plant on the north side of the system. The Moffett treatment plant has a capacity of about 120 million gallons a day. And I'll talk about that. It was built in the 1930s. It's kind of a cool looking kind of Art Deco facility, but it's obviously pretty old. South system originates in Summit County. Dillon Reservoir is owned by Denver Water. We divert water through the Roberts Tunnel into the North Fork of the South Platte River, and then also a number of reservoirs, Antero, 11 Mile, Cheeseman, all funneling down into the Denver metro area on the south side, primarily treated by the Foothills treatment plant, which has a capacity of about 280 million gallons a day. In water from there can also go into the Marsden treatment plant, which has a capacity of about 250 million gallons a day. So those are the three major treatment plants that we have. We also have a recycled treatment plant where we treat water that's previously treated by Metro wastewater. We retreat it and then bring it back into the city for irrigation purposes. You can see our service area here just to the south of Westminster, encompassing, as I mentioned, about half the city and county of Denver and about half the suburbs, with the exception of the hole in the donut there is the city of Inglewood, which is not served by Denver Water. So just talking a little bit about our process toward the development of the North Water Treatment Plant, it probably helps to explain a little bit about the context of our overall planning process, which is really defined by a philosophy of building the right project at the right time at the right cost. We begin with what we call our integrated resource plan, which is essentially a 50-year look ahead that's based on principles of scenario planning. Scenario planning, unlike the kind of old school water planning where you would look at population growth and then you would look at water supply and you would do kind of a linear projection and say, well, the population is going to be this, we need this, here's the gap, and we need this much water. I think planning today is a lot more complicated than that, with climate change, with regulatory issues, with disruptive influences like pandemics and other things that happen. Water use is not dictated simply in a linear pattern. It depends on what type of growth occurs, whether it's suburban growth or urban growth. It depends on the landscaping that's involved. In a warming climate, demands will go up, water supply things will change, runoff will change. We're going to see more catastrophic wildfires, more severe weather events. And so we look at everything from kind of what the metro area might look like in 50 years, what's driving that, and how can we meet our responsibilities to serve our customers 50 years into the future, so that we can be adaptable and nimble and meet those changing conditions. That scenario planning process then feeds into shorter term 20-year capital planning look-aheads. We actually do a financial plan based on a 10-year look ahead of anticipated projects that we might need within the next 10 years. That informs, as I say, our financial plan and our bonding programs. We then have a 2-year kind of construction window for projects, because obviously projects go from beyond just one calendar year, and then a capital budget that's approved annually by our board. So it's a continually iterative process where every year we're looking ahead 50 years, 20 years, 10 years, and then ultimately a budget that's approved on a 1-year cycle. So in terms of the North Water Treatment Plant, I mentioned our 3 major treatment plants, Moffett, Marsden, and Foothills. We originally developed a benchmark of, or a goal of being able to meet our peak day demands, which were anticipated to be 500 million gallons a day, with one of those plants out of service for whatever reason. So we basically planned on having 3 250 MGD plants to be able to cover a potential 500 MGD peak day demand. When we were assessing the Moffett treatment plant and what to do with it, and a number of things I think came to light in that process of looking at Moffett. I think you all have gone through some similar exercises. The Moffett treatment plant, when it was originally built in the 1930s, there wasn't anything around it. And now it's got neighborhoods and encroachment, and it's a very constrained site. It's also a very old site. We don't know exactly what's there. We're in the process right now of doing some projects that I'll talk about, but every time we put a backhoe in the ground, we find something we didn't know was there. So a lot of challenges to that site, which led us to look at the possibility of just building a new treatment plant at a new location. In the process of doing that, we reassessed our original benchmark of 500 MGD as a peak day demand and 3 treatment plants being able to meet that, because in our peak day demands, because of conservation, because of changing demand patterns within our service area, is really only running about 370 MGD. So we kind of went away from that 500 MGD benchmark. And for the reasons I indicated in terms of the challenges at Moffett, began a process of looking at a new water treatment plant near Ralston Reservoir on Highway 93. If you've been out that way, you can't miss it. It's a major construction project that's going on right there, kind of just to the west of Candelas. And we looked at building the NTP project at 150 MGD and kind of proceeded down that road of building it at that capacity. And as we evolved, there were a couple of things that kind of influenced what we're ultimately doing there. First of all, we challenged the engineering team to build a plant that could literally be run off the electric grid for sustainability reasons, for security reasons, for efficiency reasons. And so that drove them to build as small and efficient a design as they could come up with, to look for ways to generate energy in the treatment process and on site. We happen to have a reservoir right there that we can use hydroelectric energy as well. And they did such a good job that it's actually going to be a net energy producer. So we're actually going to be selling power back to the grid from that plant. And we proceeded toward about 30% design. And as we were doing that, we were continually asking ourselves questions about, is this the right project at the right time at the right cost? And it led to a decision-making process that we call choosing by advantages. We're an organization that's driven by continuous improvement, which means we are constantly looking at ways to more efficiently fulfill our mission. It's looking constantly at doing things better, and has a philosophy of really deferring decisions until what we call the last responsible moment. So even though we were going down the road of designing this plant at 150 MGD, we were continually questioning whether that was the right size or not. Were there other alternatives? So we went through this process, and without going into detail, we ultimately brought in experts from across the organization, from treatment, from distribution, from water supply planning and system collection, as well as just the treatment plant operators. And it was interesting to be in the room and see a lot of light bulbs go off across the organization, realizing that building a treatment plant had implications across the entire system. It wasn't just plug and play a new treatment plant at this particular location and just go on about your business. There were effects at the Foothills plant, there were effects in our distribution system, there were interrelationships between the north side of our system and the south side of our system. And long story short, through that process, the team decided that we could cut the capacity of that plant in half, down to 75 MGD, but modularize it so that we could double the size when we needed to double the size. We could continue, we had planned to retire the Moffett treatment plant, but we realized that there were some treatment trains at Moffett that weren't so old that we could maybe continue to utilize for another 20 years or so, get another 20 years of life out of the Moffett treatment plant. In the meantime, undertake improvements at our Foothills plant to bifurcate that plant so that we didn't have to take that plant out of production for servicing all at once, and improve some bottlenecks in our distribution system that would basically solve all of the problems that we were talking about and saving literally tens of millions of dollars. And that process really led us to continue to work on a more kind of robust, I guess, capital development philosophy of how we approach capital projects, where we really employ risk management principles. So before we embark on a project, we want to fully understand and identify and understand what the risks and opportunities are associated with that project. We want it based on our integrated resource plan, so it's the ultimate long-range planning. We have a commitment towards sustainability. I mentioned the kind of the net zero goal for this plant. We have our customers first mentality, so again, at the right cost that meets the needs of our customers without overbuilding or unnecessarily building. We need to align the solutions with our asset management principles so we understand how it fits into assessing the useful life of all of our various assets and how it fits in. We really began a commitment toward what we call system flexibility, which means modularity and incremental development, not building, again, not overbuilding, but creating opportunities so that we can make different decisions in the future, not locking ourselves into one direction, and learning from all the change that we continue to go through to give ourselves opportunities to make different decisions later down the road. Once we're smarter, always reserving the right to get smarter. We assume scarcity of resources so that we employ the most efficient methods, and then we really strive toward rate stability so that we avoid disruptive spikes in our rates. We have planned rate increases our customers can understand and budget for those rate increases going forward, and that they're stable and steady going forward. So in terms of, I think, kind of lessons learned, there were a lot of lessons learned in that philosophy, but I think some of the lessons that we learned from this process were not to be constrained by past assumptions, to always reassess what your past assumptions were, to look for alternative solutions, even as you're planning a current solution, to look for collaborative partnerships within the organization, outside the organization. Are there things beyond, for example, our geographic boundaries where we can collaborate with other jurisdictions to accomplish mutual goals? And to look for holistic solutions to a particular problem. For example, we are not only involved in capital development of our gray infrastructure, but we're heavily involved with the United States Forest Service on forest treatments in our watersheds to prevent the impacts of catastrophic wildfires. We've invested with the Forest Service over $60 million over the last 15 years or so toward forest treatments in our watershed areas. And our commitment to sustainability is another example of that. So with that, I will just say that's kind of the process we went through. Those are kind of some of the lessons we learned through that planning for the North Water Treatment Plant.
Perfect, thank you. At this time, any questions? Councilor Baker?
Thank you. I was absolutely pleased to hear you say the right project at the right location at the right price. The price is very important in whatever you do. I was also intrigued when you talked about modularized, and I would assume these are, and you use the term treatment trains. Mm-hmm. So this is something where you put in raw water at the beginning and you get finished water at the end?
Correct, and then also built so that you can just do a mirror image of it. So we built this at 75 MGD. There's space where we can do a mirror image and develop another 75 MGD.
75 MGD train,
yeah.
just right next to it.
Yeah.
Because we have that in one of our plans. We have these modules and space to mirror it and put another module in. And I'm really very pleased to hear that they're almost self-contained, almost like a Brita water filter, it sounds like.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else? Oh, Councilor Namella?
Thank you. It was really helpful to hear the thought process that you went through, and especially it was interesting to hear that you were, still evaluating other alternatives. I'm just wondering two things. How long from the point at which you decided, yes, we need to do an additional facility, to the point in which you actually got it online or got it at least under construction? So how long was it? And then what is, in general, like what was the overall cost?
I'm going to guess it was about 3 years. We went through years of internal planning about whether to redo the Moffett plant or build a new one. Once we landed on the new one, I will stand to be corrected, but my recollection, I'm going to guess about 3 years, 2 to 3 years before we actually began construction, went through that process. Total cost is about $570 million.
Just curious, is some of that, I'm assuming a lot of that might be new pipes to convey the water from the site too, in addition to the facility? Or?
Yeah, it's the treatment plant. It's the conduits coming from the plant. I don't think that cost includes collateral work at Moffett. It might include some of that work as well.
Councilor DeMott, Mayor Pro Tem DeMott.
First, thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate the fact to have so much expertise in the room to help us kind of bounce some ideas off of. When you talk about the Moffett plant, You had mentioned that you potentially might get another, I can't remember the year, if you said 20 or 30 years. So what, like by the end of that cycle, how old will that plant be? And the other question that I have is, with your other plants, what ages are they? And trying to just get a sense, because I mean, for me, one of the frustrating things in this process is when we look at a building and say, oh, it's 50 years old, we got to replace it. That's not, in my world, I'm an IT guy, and we don't always do that. Is it useful still? Can we rehab it? You know, what would it cost? And then you go through the cost analysis. Does it make more sense to replace it if it still functions? And obviously, we're dealing with IT in my world versus safe drinking water, but still there are components of a network that, you know, just even in a water system, there are components of IT that are critical. And sometimes they go past what the industry might say is useful life, to the point where manufacturers won't warranty it anymore. So I'm very curious around the age of things, because, and I like the approach that you shared, you know, as you reevaluated and said, what can we still get useful out of it, and did that cost analysis. So I am curious kind of age of your different plants, and when you think that one will go off, how old it will be.
Moffett plant was built in the 1930s. And I think some of the trains that I mentioned were developed in the 1960s. And as I mentioned, we went through that useful, it's like a, you know, at what point do you sell your car? Does it become too expensive? You want that perfect sweet spot where it's just about to break, and you can then sell it and give somebody else your problems. But, you know, that's the whole kind of art about asset management. But we obviously went through that process with the Moffett treatment plant, decided what was worth keeping, what's worth kind of leaving, how much we can continue to squeeze out of it, and anticipate, you know, about 20 years of additional life out of that plant to supplement the North Water treatment plant. The Foothills plant was built in the 1970s. It is every system has issues, but it's, you know, got its own set of issues that we're looking at in terms of capital, including the fact that when it goes out of service, we have to take the whole thing out of service, and it's really the workhorse of our system. So modularizing that will really help give us additional flexibility. The Marston treatment plant, I'm going to say, was built in the 1960s or 50s. So we anticipate using that and Foothills both for the indefinite future.
Great, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councilor Izadi?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you all for coming to this. I'm very excited about this, to learn from all of you and to get the historical context of your past experiences and current experiences. And thank you, Jim. That was an excellent presentation of Denver Water. I have a few questions that I think I could wrap up into one to be respectful of people's time. You know, just like what the Mayor Pro Tem said about age of systems, right? It's not logical to compare by age. I also believe it's not logical to compare by proximity. So when we compare Westminster to other municipalities, I think there's a lot more that goes into that. And the question I have for you, you mentioned criteria for last responsible moment. You said that identifying and assessing that last responsible moment is what you called it, is part of your principles, right? Mm-hmm. As to your decision making. What kind of criteria do you use to, do you have a set of specific criteria, or how is that judged?
Well, again, there's a time when you know you have to pull the trigger and do the project, or you need to make the decision to go or no go. But I think up until that time, we remain open to reassessing. So it's you know, plan, keep planning, make sure you got it right, make sure you've answered all the questions before you ultimately pull the trigger on doing it. It's not a hesitancy to make a decision. It's just making sure that you continually reassess your alternatives and your options, so you make sure it's the right decision when it has to be made.
Yeah, I can imagine it's tough, right? It's a tough call because when you look at a treatment plant like Semper, right? So we all just took a tour of Semper and we saw the deficiencies. It's using 1960s technology. There's several deficiencies in the system that just needs to be replaced. And when I think through that and when I hear what you were talking through, that last responsible moment, you know, it does signal to me and others, I think, that maybe we do need to define what that means for us as a city, and we can't use our Veda or Greeley or various other cities to compare. It's very specific to us, our asset maturation, our deficiencies, the population size is very different than Denver, for example. But those principles that you laid out, that you follow, I think that's something for sure we can look into developing here. Thank you for that.
Great, thank you.
If there's not anything else, we can always come back and pick your brain, but let's go to Greeley and Jim, Adam. Tell us what you've been about and if you've done anything like what we have with our Semper plant, and tell us your story.
Sure. And I'm happy to share a little bit about the fire impacts as well. I understand you were interested in hearing about that, but just a little bit about the Greeley community itself. We're about 115,000 people, and it's a rapidly growing community, second fastest growing community in the state behind Broomfield. Greeley's projected to over double in population in the next 30 to 40 years. Our 2060 horizon is about 260,000 people. We have 25 square miles of undeveloped land within our growth management area, and there's plenty of land outside of that if the city wants to annex further. So we're in the mindset of keeping ahead of growth as it pertains to developing our water system. Greeley collects water from 4 basins from the Cashlaputer, that's our primary supply, the Big Thompson, which flows through Loveland, the Laramie River, which is north part of the state, flows up into Wyoming, and then the Colorado River through the Colorado Big Thompson project and the Windy Gap project. Those are projects owned and operated by a separate entity, Northern Water, but we're a participant in that, so we get water via our participation. Greeley very strategically planned to develop water supplies in multiple basins as a redundancy in case there's any issue in any single basin. We have 2 water treatment plants. One, the Bellevue plant, which is west of Fort Collins. It's a 30 million gallon a day plant. And then the Boyd treatment plant, which is in Loveland, which is a 38 million gallon a day plant. The Bellevue plant has been Greeley's main water source since 1907, and it's undergone several expansions over the years. Most recently in 2019, we did a major replacement with a 20 MGD treatment train. And just as Jim said, it's a modular design where we can stack on additional 20 MGD treatment plants up to 3 additional ones as we grow. Our trigger for replacing facilities is really largely influenced by the community's need. As demand grows, we need to add additional capacity. That's a good time to replace aging infrastructure. So if we need to expand a facility, a lot of times we'll replace it instead of enlarging some of the older ones. We also are the sewer provider for the city of Greeley, and we operate a wastewater treatment plant, about 400 miles of wastewater pipe. Back on water, we have 600 miles of pipe. We provide water to we're a wholesale treatment and conveyance provider for about 50,000 additional folks in Windsor, Evans, Milliken, and Johnstown. So we have an obligation to those communities. They provide the raw water, we treat and deliver. We also operate a non-potable water system, so that's untreated water that we deliver throughout town. That's actually one of our primary objectives right now, is to expand that system, in part as a way to reduce the peak demands on our treatment plants so that we do not have to undergo expansion as soon. And we expect that expanding the non-potable system will delay expansion of our treatment plants by 5 to 10 years. On the fire, 2020 was a bad year for us. I said we have 4 watersheds that we collect water from, and that was strategic for redundancy. Well, we didn't expect in a single year that all 4 of them would have a major fire. The Cameron Peak fire burned in the Poudre, Big Thompson, Laramie River watersheds, burned 209,000 acres, largest fire in Colorado history. And then the East Troublesome fire burned on the west slope in the Colorado River Basin, about 190,000 acres. And that was the second largest fire in Colorado history. So we're not just number 1, we're number 2. Those fires were predicted to some degree. I mean, our water resource planning has long acknowledged that fires in our watersheds were very likely, and that it would cause water supply disruptions. And even now, the Poudre River watershed, having had this burn in 2020 and a pretty bad burn in 2012 with the High Park fire, we're running out of things to burn. And we assume that whatever's there is probably going to burn some point in the future, and we should be ready for that. Even with forest thinning, with the suppression efforts that are available and that the Forest Service and Greeley and many other partners are working together on, we're going to see these type of fires. Hopefully we're not the mega fires, but we're going to see fires nonetheless. We have learned a lot of lessons from our experience with the 2012 High Park fire about the best ways of mitigating a watershed after a fire to prevent impacts to our water supply. But honestly, there's only so much we can do. Mitigating landscapes on that scale is very difficult, very expensive. For context, last year we spent $18 million on post-fire mitigation. We were able to mitigate roughly 6,000 acres with $18 million. So 6,000 down, 203,000 left to go. It's going to be very expensive to do full mitigation, impossible to do that. Some of the effects after a burn, when there's rainfall over a burn area, that burned landscape has lost all the vegetation. The soil itself is actually burned and becomes hydrophobic. Water can't absorb. And so following a rainfall, we see large sediment and debris flows off the watershed and into the river. Large amounts of sediment are delivered, and we can't treat that. What we have to do is just shut our intake and let that water float on by. We just can't treat it. Last year, we had to go 40 days without being able to treat water off the river. Luckily, we have a second treatment plant, and we have use of Colorado River water stored in Horsetooth Reservoir, so we were able to get by. But if we had a drought combined with these fire impacts, we'd be in a lot of trouble. The fire also increases our treatment costs. Even after a rain event has passed and the large amount of sediment has dropped out, it still increases the baseline turbidity, which increases the amount of chemicals we have to put in, decreases the rate at which we can process water, and it generates a lot of additional costs for us. Our primary means of mitigating a fire is to aerial mulch the burned areas. We drop mulch from helicopters, and it's not the garden mulch that you may think of. It's large woody debris or woody strands, and that mulch locks in and holds the water back, holds the sediment in place, hopefully allows vegetation to regenerate. We saw some really good success with that kind of method after the 2012 High Park fire, and we're hoping to see the same for the Cameron Peak fire. This year we have about $20 million lined up. A lot of that is federal funding, luckily, but the city is putting in quite a bit of its own funding to see this happen. So Each fire is different. Lessons learned is that we are still learning from this fire. Each behaves differently. The amount of sediment that comes off is differently. We expect to see impacts for another 5 to 10 years. These are long impacts. Another lesson learned is that money is mitigation. Mitigation is money. It takes a lot of money to restore a watershed. And, you know, full recovery is probably more funding than what we can do. So we'll do the best we can. I'll just circle back to treatment plants and some of the lessons we've learned, because that seems like it's a big topic for this city. I think really historically underinvested in some of our water treatment plants, and it led to some taste and odor issues that we've had to correct, especially as we have new maybe out-of-state transplants or transplants from elsewhere in Colorado have moved to Greeley and have said, well, we don't like water tasting like this in the summer when it comes out of a reservoir. And our Boyd Lake treatment plant uses water from Boyd Lake. It grows algae. It starts tasting poor in late summer. So we've had to invest quite a bit. We've invested $15 million in the last 3 years, and we're programmed to invest another $3 to $3.5 million for the next 5 years per year for the next 5 years to address those taste and odor issues. And then on our Bellevue plant, we did let it go a little too long before we replaced it, and really ran into some reliability issues there at the last couple years before we replaced it. There was a lot of duct tape and baler wire holding a treatment plant together, which is not the right way to do. Luckily now we've replaced that. It's state of the art, and we're in really good shape for the foreseeable future. So, yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Questions? Councilor Baker.
Thank you. You had a couple absolutely fascinating things to me. I know of about 3 ways to treat water. One is with the ferric chloride, one is with ozone oxygen, and one is through a membrane. Supposedly the ozone way is the best way to address taste and color of water. Is that what you've done to meet your taste demands?
We did. We added an ozonation system on in the plant, and we've also started oxygenating water within Boyd Lake to address some of the algae issues. So we're treating in the lake itself as well as in the treatment plant.
Okay. And you again seem to use these plug and play, modules, treatment trains.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Councilor Izadi?
Thank you, Adam. That was great. I have a few questions linked to your treatment plant. You mentioned that you went 40 days without being able to treat water due to the fires. My first is a 3-part question almost. My first part of that question is, what was the impact to the residents? So I think you had said you had a second plant that helped with that, but was there any impact to the residents at all with that, and what could have been done in your opinion? Because you mentioned historically Greeley had underinvested in the water system. If they had invested more, would that have prevented? Is part of that first question. And my second question there is the reliability issues. That replacement with more state-of-the-art asset parts. Can you go into that a little bit more and how you feel that would prevent future impacts to your residents?
With regards to the fire impacts this summer and having to turn off the use of the Poudre River, that had no impacts to our residents. We were able to seamlessly turn to a different water supply and continue the water running. Our residents didn't notice anything. But what it did mean is that we were forced to use our backup supply, which luckily is there, but is in general less reliable from a water supply, water rights standpoint. You know, when there's a rainfall over a burn area, the water turns black, and it's easy to say it's, you know, it's black. It looks like Pennzoil. It is absolutely untreatable by any treatment plant. And so we're really at Mother Nature's mercy at that point. We have to just let that water go by. So there's no plant that we could build that would be able to handle that at a reasonable cost. And could you repeat the second part of your question, please?
So the reliability issues where you replaced it with more state-of-the-art parts.
Sure. That really came down to needing to expand the capacity of the plant to serve a growing city. So we waited until the water demand had grown to the point that it really justified putting in a new treatment plant. But up until that point, we were relying on a treatment plant that was built in the 40s and had really probably gone past its prime. We never had an issue where we were unable to deliver water, largely because we have a backup plant. But there were the maintenance issues and the number of times we would need to shut it down and drain it to be able to do repairs just kept increasing. And each time you shut down a plant, it's a risk, right? There's a time where you're relying only on one plant, so you're down one redundancy. You never know what other problems you're going to find whenever you empty a plant, and there's a risk of things going wrong. So those kind of events became more and more frequent as the plant aged. But our customers never saw an impact, to be clear.
And I imagine more expensive, right? So rather than the increasing frequency with increasing costs to those repairs, it would be cheaper long-term to actually replace it. So was that part of your criteria?
That was, exactly. Just as Jim was saying, you're trying to find that sweet spot when replacing makes more sense than repairing. And we maintain an asset management staff and program that does that evaluation to help us decide when the time is right. And that decision was made again in 2019.
Thank you.
Councilor Numela?
Thank you, Tom. This question may be for both Tom and Jim. Just as you're both talking about, creating and building new facilities and setting aside capital improvements, how much do you rely on your water rate revenues to pay for those improvements? Have you had to significantly increase water rates in relation to these big investments?
Yes, we certainly have. We have this past year was a 6% increase, and in previous years it was between 6 and 9% annual increases in the water rate. We pay for our capital improvements through a combination of rate revenue and debt. Greeley does bond for a significant amount of its capital improvement plan, and that's very strategic to push the cost of these improvements, which are to benefit future residents, to future residents. So we use debt to push that cost forward. We're running at about $5 per 1,000 gallons, which puts Greeley in the middle of the pack along the front range of what water costs are. But we are conscious of our escalating water costs impacting some of our customers in lower income brackets. And Greeley does have a significant population of folks in the lower socioeconomic brackets, so we have to very carefully raise our rates with that in mind. And we do offer affordability program to provide assistance back to folks who have a hard time paying those bills.
And I know I just called you Tom, so thank you, Adam.
That's all right.
I wasn't going to correct.
Sorry.
I'll answer to anything.
I can't get my kids' names right either. Jim, sorry.
Yeah, very, very similar. We use a combination of rates generally fund operating costs, and so our capital program is funded out of both cash reserves and debt. And the capital program largely really drives our long-term financial plan, our 10-year financial plan. We're in the midst of probably our heaviest capital program in our history. We're going to spend about $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. We hopefully have planned for that carefully. When I first came to Denver Water, the year before I got there, they raised rates about 10%. The next year that I was there, we raised them 5.5%. We've been at about 2.5% to 3% per year ever since. And so as I mentioned before, the objective is slow and steady and predictable, so that we plan carefully. We use cash reserves as a buffer to be able to mitigate against downturns, and utilize our debt finance program to largely fund the capital.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. Some of the questions spurred some thoughts. So when you talked about replacement in the Greeley plant, you said that was driven by growth. And so the thought that I have there is I think the point was made earlier that Westminster has its unique challenges to our city. So, and I think one of the challenges you've both just alluded to is being able to have increases that are sustainable to your ratepayers, but also sustain the system. And that's always been the balance that I've been interested in. And so I hope this is okay. It's a little, I don't know if this is out of order or not, but we certainly have some people here that have been part of that decision-making process here in the city of Westminster. And being that we're a lot closer to what you would consider build-out than Greeley would be, and even the area that Denver Water covers, how has that balance been stricken in the past? Because I think that's one of those things is when you talk about replacing the Greeley plant, it was done because of growth, not necessarily because of technology, although there's a benefit there because you're going to be able to get the latest technology. But I'm interested in that and the balance that we've seen over the past and how we've struck that balance here in the city of Westminster in the past, to make sure that we're forward thinking, because I think at the end of the day, same thing that you guys want, we want to get to a place where we're a balanced system where we're planning for replacement of the future as it comes, and funding it with more smaller incremental increases that people with their cost of living increases can take on those increases.
Either of you.
Well, you're going to hear a lot of the same things from Bill and me, because we, I think, had very similar philosophies, probably with respect to just about everything we did as city managers, but certainly with respect to utilities. And the rate structure that we tried to create and follow during my 14 years was one of regular, manageable rate increases that allowed us to, one, operate the system and also invest in repair, replacement, and capital improvements. And I think you're always trying to find that balance. You could always have, on the one hand, someone arguing that we should do more and therefore the rates should be higher, or you could have an equally valid argument, somebody saying, no, we don't need to do that much. These assets have a longer life than we're giving them credit for. We don't need to do as much. So we were, and had many discussions with City Council about appropriate rates, and we tried to approach them in terms of rate increases, looking at those increases, actually adopting them on a 2-year basis. So again, we could plan, and people could plan that into their budgets, and also try to avoid huge spikes. You want to comment?
No, go ahead. No, you're doing fine. I agree with you.
Do you want me to go into some other things I was going to? Did I answer your question, Mr. Dumont?
You did, and I'm also curious, since you guys, as you hit things, I'm curious about what the strategy was around fire mitigation, because that's been a big point of, this is why we're doing that. And I've always had to imagine, with this well overrun city as you all have run for the decades, that it wasn't something that you didn't think about and we didn't try to plan for, understanding you have to weigh risks versus costs, and what you're willing to accept as far as a risk.
And certainly fire is one element of that in the watershed. And Tom's probably really the one to talk about this, but there's all kinds of things in the watershed that impact the water quality coming down to us and into Stanley Lake and then into our treatment system. And
can I was going to have Tom tell us his story, and then I was going to have sort of interview with you two because of
the
what's been
troublemaker. I messed
said.
up her flow.
so in other words, you want the expert to actually talk about
No,
this.
no, but I just thought it's good to have our plant people talk and then go back to administration and how you came to different things. And I have a list of questions here for you guys to just play off of each other, but I wanted our sort of experts in their realm to share with us. And Tom, tell us the dates you were here, and you worked at Semper, or you worked with Semper.
Yes.
And then tell us about, I'm thinking that, did you have sort of a similar experience in Boulder where they were going to decommission something and then they changed their mind and you did something else with it?
I can
So tell us
speak
your
to all
story.
of it, and hopefully I don't get too long-winded, shut me down.
I'm watching the clock.
Like she did me.
You could do that to friends.
So as I had said at the onset, I did have several different roles in Westminster, and my early roles were actually plant operator, and ultimately operated all 3 of Westminster's water plants. At one time we had the England water plant, which was at the south end of town, which has now been cleared off the site, and Northwest was built to replace it. In Boulder, we had 2 water plants as well. When I made the transition from Westminster to Boulder, I was actually quite surprised. I always had a vision of Boulder being a very advanced, ahead of the game type organization. And what I found was that their utility planning was probably 5 to 10 years behind Westminster's. And what I'm speaking to, and Jim and Adam may be able to speak to this a little bit, but this is the same topic that we're hearing on a national level quite a bit these days in terms of the condition of our infrastructure. And water utilities certainly is part of that infrastructure. And all of our local governments and water and wastewater districts have been in a process over the last 10 to 20 years of learning, and in some cases the hard way, that although we get things built and in the ground, we're not doing enough planning for the future and replacement or reconditioning of those systems. And that's where a lot of the whole discussion behind water rates and big increases has come from, is people trying to catch up. In my experience with Westminster, I had seen how we manage things. In Bill's tenure, for instance, we were in growth mode, and a lot of our water utility maintenance was handled during our expansion projects that were dealing with growth. So our water rates were able to be kept at a low level and so forth, but we were doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice in terms of looking into the future. And in most organizations, the maintenance part, the restoration, et cetera, should be built into your water utility rates, and your growth should be built into your tap fees. And we had the advantage of using our tap fees and incorporating it into projects, and by adding those extra things to the projects, we would leverage pricing of the contractors and things like that. So it was to our advantage.
Right.
And then in 2006, roughly 2006, we began a transition away from that approach to better documentation of our overall assets, an asset inventory, if you were, and then building our water rates themselves to accommodate taking care of all those assets. And that's kind of been the process since then. I haven't been here now in eight years, so I've lost touch with some of what most might be going on currently. But when I left in 2014, we had completed the construction, I'll call it, of our asset inventory of the water and wastewater utilities, as well as the reclaim utility, and had begun to establish a new 20-year CIP plan around that asset inventory and keeping all the pieces working properly. And I was extremely happy with what had been put together. The engineering group had done a great job, and we'd gotten good support from the administration as well as council. And yes, there was some, even in that time, there was some pretty significant rate increases to make that leap, if you will, from using tap fees and so forth to using our rates to maintain the systems into the future. But it was nicely laid out, and at that time I could see that Semper, for instance, in Northwest would be well taken care of. I'm not sure whether I've gotten off track with that question or not here at that point.
I think that I don't think so, but I think the other thing that we had asked about was what measures or what strategy was the city going to employ if we did have something like a fire in the watershed or any other kind of thing. I imagine you could have a spill in
Sure.
the watershed.
Clear Creek.
But how we heard from Greeley how they just let the water flow on by. And were able to take water from somewhere else. I'm curious the strategy that was there, because obviously that's a risk that you have to overcome or figure out what's acceptable to live with.
No, we had developed over time a really strong strategy in that realm. There had been a good tenure of staff in our water resources group, the water treatment group, utilities in general, and public works, and had begun working together quite well and understood how all of the pieces worked individually and how they could take care of each other holistically, and develop some strategies. And the beauty of the system that Westminster has is that Stanley Lake is roughly a 1-year water supply of storage, and it is off channel. So as you've probably had explained to you over the last few months, water is delivered from Clear Creek via 3 different canal systems to Stanley Lake. And we have the option of closing the gate on those 3 diversions if the call needs to be made. I know you also have other players in Stanley Lake, North Glen and Thornton. In the past, there was discussions with North Glen, for instance, about who would make the call about doing something like that, shutting the water off to the lake, and it was very important to North Glen because similar to Westminster, it was their only water supply. Thornton has the luxury of having other sources of water similar to Greeley or Denver. But Westminster and Northglenn don't have that luxury necessarily. The part of the water resources work product, in addition to all the watershed protection work that we did, was also to work with Northglenn and assure them that if we had to make that call, and it was the right call for everybody involved, which it would be, that Westminster would assist them and keep them whole from a water supply standpoint. You know, we would use some of our reserve water supply or safety reserves, we might call them, and help maintain their water supply as well. In terms of wildfires, we had some discussion of it. It's not a matter of if, it's when. It will happen. And in the past, in our discussions of that, it was always, hey, we'll utilize our bypass facility, our bypass capability. That applied to not only wildfires, it applied to acid mine drainage. The many mines that are up in the Clear Creek drainage, which is numbers, as I recall, was around 2,500, would have what they termed blowouts. They accumulate water over time, and they would hit a breaking point, and this water would come flushing out of some of those tunnels around, especially around Idaho Springs, and into Clear Creek and turn it orange, just like the Animas River in Durango a few years ago.
Right.
So we were not exempt from that problem either. So there are multiple elements that are risk factors for Westminster, and there again, just the inherent nature of Stanley Lake, its location and how it's filled is a great benefit. And the operation of those water rights in those situations gets tricky, and in my opinion, I think there's been enough institutional knowledge lost in the organization over time that some of those pieces have kind of fallen out of place and forgotten, or just people weren't aware of it. And and changes in the other organizations, Northglenn, Thornton, et cetera. So it's something that I think is worth the staff looking at, reevaluating, et cetera, and in looking through the treated water master plan that was developed by Jacobs. I think one thing that stuck out to me also was driving that project was the level of service assumption. So what are the criteria by which we want to operate our system? Jim had mentioned how they wanted to be able to still provide their daily demand under a loss of one major component, one plant, for instance. Westminster's level of service, as I understand it, according to the Treated Water Master Plan, is that we would have something similar, which is a noble target, but it's also expensive. It's difficult, and the twist is, in my understanding, is that the target is to maintain the ability to provide maximum day demand. So on the worst summer day, we're not interrupting the service to our citizens at all. It's expensive, and I think that's worth evaluation, whether or not that really is what you want the target to be, and what the difference in cost might be to achieve that goal versus my view in the past has always been our goal is to provide the high quality drinking water to our citizens all the time that they need for daily use. And that does not necessarily mean maintaining lush green lawns or what have you in short-term emergencies. So I think all of the citizens of Westminster would be willing to, help out if there was a need that arose in terms of the organization, in terms of doing their part to help hold down the costs of operating the system. So,
Thank you.
If I might, Mayor, going back to Mayor Pro Tem's question about fire and other factors that can impact water quality in the Clear Creek Basin, several times, at least in my tenure, there would be either a gasoline truck or diesel truck that would have an accident and would spill into Clear Creek. And it was, we had a standard operating procedure, as Tom touched on, with Thornton and North Glen as far as shutting the gates off and keeping the water out of coming into Stanley Lake. So, it's not just fire it's always a concern, but other impacts that can come into the watershed and impact the water quality. But there's been, and this has been going on for 40 years or more.
It happens a lot more frequently than you all know.
Than you might be aware. But there's a SOP, a standard operating procedure, as far as notifying the appropriate people at the cities if something like that does happen. Second point, as far as an emergency situation, and I don't know if these are still in effect, but we had intergovernmental agreements with other cities, and of course it needed to be other than North Glen and Thornton, because they're in the same boat as Westminster, but also with Arvada and Broomfield and other surrounding cities, where they would provide either raw or treated water to whatever extent they could, with interfacing with Westminster systems. And by that I'm thinking canals, diversions out of canals, or in some cases treated water could be provided in an emergency situation. Fortunately, that hadn't had to be utilized much at all, at least during my tenure as city manager, but it was there in place. It's kind of like a mutual aid agreement with fire departments. In a case of emergency, others would step up and help you.
Does anybody have questions for Tom? Councilor Baker? No?
no,
Oh.
not for Tom.
Okay, then to our two city managers. Here's some things that I've heard that get to what these folks do. And let's go back to, I don't remember which year it was, but we did have a 6-month or 9-month moratorium in Big Dry Creek. I'd love for you to talk about that and what you know about Big Dry Creek, and if that moratorium just how you viewed that. Was there ever any talk about making Stanley Lake deeper? How did you go about your rates and CIP? If you have been here, and I know Brent, you haven't been for the last few years, but there are some situations we've been in where people would say for the last 30 years we've never had a CIP plan or looked at anything ever. So please talk about how you did that, what you did, and talk about the growth management, because I think that is critical. So I give you lots of things. Just play off each other. Share with us.
Okay. Can I start? I'd like to start with one thing, which is sort of answers one of your questions. But I want to say it, so I'm going to say it. I had the opportunity to look through the CH2M study that I believe is the genesis of the replacement water plant project. And what I saw was what I thought was sort of a fundamental flaw in the assumption of the study. And that is the way the study treated the Northwest Water Treatment Plant. The the study refers to the Northwest Water Treatment Facility as a peaking plant, which it is. And a peaking plant, just like an electric utility, has a couple of the extra turbines they can turn on between 3 and 7 on a summer afternoon. A peaking plant in a water utility is similar. On those heavy demand days when your main plant is running at capacity or near capacity, you can bring that peaking plant online and meet your treated water demand. And certainly Northwest meets that criteria. But there was a much more basic reason for the Northwest Water Treatment Facility, and that is that it was designed to have sufficient treatment capacity to meet the domestic water supply use in the city on any given day. So not necessarily outdoor watering, but indoor domestic water use. It was specifically sized to be able to handle that. So Semper could in fact go completely offline, and Northwest Treatment Facility would have the ability to serve our domestic water supply needs in the city. So that's important, I think, from a redundancy standpoint. But what is more important, and I think particularly more important with respect to the CH2M study, is that another element of that thinking around Northwest Treatment Facility was that, particularly during winter months, Northwest could be used to meet the domestic supply in the city because you're not doing outdoor watering during that period of time. And Semper could be taken offline to do not only significant maintenance, but restoration, repair, replacement of significant components of the plant. And therefore extending the life of that plant virtually indefinitely. I mean, we all know things eventually wear out. But it was not in the planning at that time that Semper would have to be replaced. And so as I read that report, I just, there's just a basic assumption in that report, I believe, in my opinion, that was simply missed. And I'm not here to argue whether or not Westminster needs to build another water treatment plant. That's your decision. And fortunately, I don't have to give you recommendations anymore. But I thought that my reason for pointing that out to you tonight is I think you all need to be aware of that and ask those questions. And maybe that causes the city manager's office and the public works utility staff to go back and take another look and come back to you maybe with the same recommendation or maybe with something different. But I think one of the basic uses of Northwest Water Treatment Facility was missed in the analysis of future water treatment facility needs in the city of Westminster.
And we might add, along that line, Northwest plant can be expanded.
Already has.
Yeah, it has.
It was expanded, and Brent is absolutely right. It was designed with the purpose of it meeting the indoor water demands of the city at build-out. So,
and and as I read the study, I mean, there's certainly no question, but the Semper site is size constrained. I mean, it just is. So, does that argue for going someplace else on a larger site plan, or can Semper be rehabilitated to meet your needs? I'm not the engineer, I don't have to decide. But I think you have more flexibility in your system than you've been led to believe.
And I might add along that line, you heard from both Adam and Jim as far as the modular approach to adding treatment capacity. And again, I'm not an engineer either, but can't help but think, I know Council has looked at this, discussed it at least preliminarily, that there potentially could be modular expansion, treatment capacity tied in with Semper, close by geographically. So I was encouraged to learn, because I didn't know this, as far as both the Denver Water Board system and the Greeley system, that's how they've gone over the years. So they've done it, and it's proven out, and is a reliable way to approach expanding capacity. And that, which is a good segue maybe to the remainder of Westminster's development. And the Mayor Pro Tem touched on this with a comment. Westminster's different from Greeley and Denver in that there isn't that much developable land left within the corporate limits of the city. And the opportunities to annex are not that good. I mean, there's opportunities you could expand land area, but they have complications. If you go to the south, you're would have to redo going down, for example, Federal Boulevard into unincorporated Adams County, and basically, either live with what's there or scrape it off and start over, and a huge cost there. Or you could go west, but then you run into the former Rocky Flat site and the complications with plutonium in the soil, depending on what your beliefs are there. So Westminster is, you might say, fairly well landlocked, in my opinion. So there's 1 or 2% of land that's developable still left to develop. But then there's also this whole future unknown as far as redevelopment in Westminster. And that takes me to the 2040 Comprehensive Land Use Plan. I think that is critical as far as council's thinking and what you want the remainder of this city to be and look like, including the remainder of the new downtown, which in part gets back to additional demand that would be placed on both utility systems, water and wastewater, and also as much as your crystal ball might show you and tell you, where do you want redevelopment to take place? By that I'm particularly thinking changing the land use. And pretty close to here we have the situation with the Rock Bottom Brewery, which is no longer the Rock Bottom Brewery. It's going to be over 300 apartment units. And in my humble opinion, you need to guard against that happening more in the city. So I guess I just want to put in a plug for how important, and it needs to come back to you, as you well know, and think through what do you want the remainder of Westminster as far as development and redevelopment to look like in the future, which then transitions into additional utility demand, which then takes me to growth management. The mayor touched on wanting us to speak to growth management. I'm a firm believer in growth management plans, and that's not to say anti-growth. Boulder was first and foremost with growth management in the state of Colorado, and we in Westminster looked at it while they were implementing it there. We were looking at other plans throughout the United States, Ramapo, New York, and Petaluma, California, and other places like that, and developed a growth management plan. But ours, the philosophy behind the one in Westminster was not to prevent growth, but to pace growth, and pace it within the, especially utilities. It's mainly utility driven, which includes water rights. It's not just treatment plant of both water and wastewater, but it's having the water to run through the plant, obviously. And that, I think, over the years served the city well. But along the way, the council decided to remove that. And I think that plus amending the comprehensive land use plan that was in place leading up to the last few years, I think the council got a little loose with amending the comp plan and allowing well over 1,000 apartment units that weren't contemplated in the comp plan at the time when it was adopted, which just exacerbated, I think, this whole problem as far as people wondering, are we going to run out of water? Do we have enough treatment plant capacity? And what about the moratorium and the Big Dry Creek basin? And was that necessary to cause that moratorium with the outfall sewer line? The point I guess I want to leave with the council is it's multifaceted. It's not just looking at the water treatment plant, whether you need to build a new plant or rehab Semper, add modulars to it, but it's also the land use and the pace of growth that you want and what the people of Westminster expect. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? I know I've talked to you, Bill, about that very topic multiple times, but I'm curious with all of you. I mean, when you talk about the comprehensive land use plan, that obviously is part of our planning, but as you try to strike the balance of water rates and taking care of a utility, I have to imagine what you're saying is that goes hand in hand, because if you didn't plan for the growth, you probably didn't plan for the growth in your utility either. And so if you change one, the other is affected drastically, where you might have to make decisions that you didn't make. And another example that I think that maybe you could speak to is, and some of this is things that are outside of the comprehensive land use plan, and I don't know how you guys have in the past planned for it, or if it's just kind of an anomaly that you didn't, but I think about the orchards. So one of the things that's specific about the orchards that's changed in the way it accesses the utility is the market changed, and it's not as retail. There's a lot more restaurants that have a different demand on our utility. So those different components, one, I just want to validate, I'm hearing you say that we have to think about that in the change management because it affects the utility.
Correct.
But also, how have you in the past planned for things like market changes, or is that just something that's new that none of you have come across to the same kind of effect?
I think you try and anticipate that, but our crystal ball's no better than yours, and so. Yeah, you try and think about that, and you try to think, well, how could these things evolve? We probably didn't think of as much about how does an outdoor regional center move away from traditional retail towards more entertainment and restaurant. Right. We probably didn't think much about that because hadn't happened before.
Nope. Interior malls were king.
But what we did think about was what are the water use needs of different kinds of development, and so if you base your utility plans on your land use plan, and those are consistent, then assuming you've done it properly, you should be moving along hand in hand. Your utilities keeping up with your demand, and you have nice stable rates that allow you to do that. If either one of those gets out of balance, then you're playing catch up. And trust me, I'm not saying it, and I don't think Bill is either, saying, adopt a land use plan and never deviate from it.
No.
Because circumstances change. And you might be presented with a development or redevelopment opportunity that nobody ever contemplated before, but you say, this is really cool and would be great for our city, and you're going to approve that. But when you do, also understand the impacts on the other side of the equation.
And I think in the example I gave, and there were 4 specific amendments to the comprehensive land use plan within about an 18-month period that allowed these 1,000 additional apartment units that weren't contemplated before, that whoever's sitting in the seat of mayor and council needs to give careful thought to the consequences of doing that. Because again, as I said before, this is all interrelated as far as the utilities, the land use, the demand that's put upon both water and wastewater systems. And while it might be, you know, the hot thing in the retail market, not retail, excuse me, in the real estate market, I've always said the city's always going to be here. It's here for the long haul. Whereas developers here today, gone tomorrow. You know, they build their plan and they leave town. You all are still here, and that's why why I favored a growth management plan was to pace the growth. And you don't have to rush to build out the city, because once you've done that, your options are pretty limited to what redevelopment will come, and the market drives that. You don't, but the market does. And one other thing, if I might, as it goes back to the whole discussion on water rates, and again, where Westminster is different than Greeley and the Denver Water Board, I can foresee the time where Westminster would be best served if you created another source of revenue for the water and wastewater funds beyond the monthly service fees based on consumption. Because let's just take the example, okay, the city is built out as far as developable land, and for whatever reasons, the redevelopment part is not happening. But yet, you've got to replace more infrastructure, and you're going to have to issue more bonds. And it's not totally then putting the same burden on the same people if you come up with something different. Whether it's a mill levy, of course, has to be voted in by the people. There you would have retail and light industrial and high tech paying more of their fair share than what they would pay through a water bill. So it isn't as heavily burdened upon the residential population. But I think the city would be wise to start thinking about that as far as just what kind of additional revenue stream could we create to supplement, because the cost of chemicals is going to keep going up, the cost of labor is going to keep going up, and certainly over time, as you've already seen, because the city's had a very aggressive water and wastewater infrastructure program, that those costs are just, you know, going through the ceiling, and don't know what the future holds for those, but those are necessary investments you have to make. And so if you can get something else in place to kind of augment or supplement your rate structure, then I think that might be helpful. And other cities, not just in Colorado, but other cities have gone a mill levy route, for example, to supplement revenue for their water and wastewater funds.
Mayor, could I just comment on a couple of other things? You asked about the Big Dry Creek wastewater trunk line, and first I want to point out that was after I retired.
That wasn't on your watch?
No, it wasn't on my watch. But I believe, and staff behind me here can either throw darts at me or confirm it. I think there were some incorrect assumptions made there, and then it was kind of came like, oops, never mind, we made a mistake. Mistakes happen. That was, if in fact my information is correct, that was a pretty big one. Tom alluded to this earlier, mentioning, for example, the strength of having Stanley Lake in the system, and it being offline, in other words, you know, fed through canals instead of directly from the stream. That's incredibly working in Westminster's favor. it also, in the event of a fire and the long-term impacts, for example, like Greeley and Denver have experienced, after the initial flush of debris, Stanley, to some degree, you don't want to think of it in these terms, but to some degree, acts like a huge settling pond. And those solids that later come into the lake, obviously in a much more diluted form, can settle out some. Still going to have impact on your treatment. And then the final point that I would make, and we had a lot of discussion about this and never came up with an adequate solution. Unlike Greeley and Denver, Westminster is dependent almost entirely upon one watershed. So that's it. You know, it's Clear Creek, because it's what, 90+% of the water supply, Tom?
Right. Well, I believe we have 4,500 acre feet of Moffett water available to us.
Yeah.
So.
But you don't have the luxury of turning off one faucet and opening another one. No. You got one faucet.
And Mayor, if I could ask some questions?
Yep, I was just getting ready. Go ahead, Councilor Baker.
Well, this is to Bill. Christopher, it's my understanding in 1976, the voters of Westminster increased the sales tax from 2% to 3% specifically for the water entity. Is that correct?
That is not correct. No, the sales tax there was a sales tax increase in 74. I don't recall one in 76.
Okay, maybe I got the date wrong.
74 was for, that's when we implemented the start of a full-time fire department. Up until then, it was strictly volunteers with a full-time fire marshal. And so that sales tax was twofold for Parks and Recreation, because also there was interest in not relying strictly on Highland Hills Park and Recreation District, because the city's boundaries they were not coterminous with Highland Hills. We were in Jefferson County. We were beyond Highland Hills, north of 120th Avenue in Adams County. So that sales tax, and again, Councilman Baker, I don't recall one in 76, but 74, I remember specifically, was both for fire department expansion and for Parks and Recreation.
Okay, thanks. And then my next question is for Jim. You're in a wonderfully unique, position, because you sell half your water to non-Denver people. And your first allegiance, of course, is to your Denver, and that's where your origin comes from. But you sell water to 750,000 other people too, and you have a wholesale water rate, correct?
Yeah, the arrangements with what we call our distributors outside city vary from entity to entity. So some of them are what we call total service, which is they're part of our system. We maintain the system, we bill customers, we deliver the water. Some are what we call read and bill, where the local district or city maintains the system, but we send water and bill the individual customers. And then some are wholesale, where we just deliver the water and the entity is responsible for the system, for the billing, for everything else.
Right. And I would assume, maybe mistakenly, that in that wholesale rate, you not only have the cost of really producing the water and the cost of maintaining the system and the really proportional share of the debt burden you're carrying, but you also have some component for savings for really future capital investment and reinvestment.
No, that last part is really covered by what we call SDCs or tap fees, which is basically a buy-in to the system, but also pays for future expansion, if that's what you're referring to.
Okay, I was just wondering if you save any of that wholesale rate for capital projects in the future.
Well, it's part of the revenue that we utilize for cash reserves that we use for capital. But largely, those rates on a year-to-year basis go to operating costs as opposed to capital.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Oh. Councilor Seymour?
Flip a coin.
Also, thanks to everyone, greatly appreciated. The question came up, was there ever consideration to make Stanley Lake deeper?
Oh, yeah.
Is it possible within the current footprint without having to raise the dam also? Because that's an incredible expense.
It's actually been done. And we also, and Tom, I don't know if you were still with the city at the time or not, but we also explored actually building a second lake at tremendous cost.
Yeah.
Which is why we didn't do it. Because as valuable as Stanley is, there's also some value in redundancy, you know, not having, pardon the pun, but all your water in one bucket. Yeah.
And so
Wouldn't be advisable primarily from an environmental standpoint.
Right.
with what's sitting on the bottom?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's you know,
We don't want to disturb it.
right.
No.
It's well entombed right now.
Good, thank you.
And I would just add, while I was manager, we looked seriously at enlarging Stanley Lake Reservoir by going higher rather than going deeper. And that was almost cost prohibitive. And also for the point that Brent brought up, again, where you're totally dependent on one facility, makes you vulnerable.
Just for example, and as we all dealt with the aftermath and the unknowns after 9/11, and we're all scrambling around thinking, was that it, or is there more, and what could it possibly be? One of the things we immediately hit on was the vulnerability of Stanley Lake. You know, what if somebody wanted to blow a hole in the dam? Not only would it be catastrophic on downstream in the city, but there goes our water supply. Now, fortunately, you know, as we tried to imagine worst case scenario, that was in fact worst case scenario that didn't happen. But it doesn't have to be a terrorist attack. It could simply be a dam failure.
Which, since my house would be about the 10th one to get hit, I do have some deep concerns about that, but still.
You'd be in trouble.
Yeah, we wouldn't know what hit us. So, thank you.
Councilor Numella?
All right, this has been very fascinating to hear. I have a question for Jim and Adam. Talk about, and kind of based on what Tom mentioned, with respect to the assumption for our system and what we should be building to. Now, Jim, you had mentioned you were kind of looking to build a facility that would allow you to have full redundancy, or at least replace one of your larger facilities, but you ended up going down to reducing that pretty significantly. So my question for both of you is, what was your assumption for redundancy in your system? What are you building to? What are you kind of